Today on Brief History, we discuss a widely respected but oftentimes forgotten warrior monarch. His reign would see great accomplishments, humiliating failures, chivalric grandeur, and the beginning of a war that would last a century. He would be held up as an example of exceptional kingship by his future generations and be much revered in his time as king. Join me as I take a brief look at Edward of Windsor, remembered today as Edward III of England. Edward was born at Windsor Castle on November 13, 1312, and this would be where his nickname would draw its origin. He was the son of Edward II of England, known as Edward of Carnarvon, and Isabella of France, sometimes referred to as the She-Wolf of France. He was the eldest child of 4 legitimate children, which included his younger brother John. As was the case with many English monarchs, not much is known of Edward's childhood. It is believed that he was brought up in his own household, and although it has never been fully confirmed, it is also believed that a woman named Margaret Daventry, a lower-born woman, played a large part in his youth due to Edward's generous giving to her later in life. Neither of his parents played much of a role in his early childhood. However, Edward was in the presence of his father at important times. Edward's father had been a much detested king in his time, playing favorites and subjugating nobles outside of his inner circle, and much of Edward's childhood saw the battles of his father play out. His father's reign would be plagued by military failure and civil disagreements between him and his baronage. A disagreement broke out between Edward's father and the King of France, Charles IV. This would end up leading to war, with Charles moving against a territory on the continent known as Gascony, which is in modern-day southwest France and was controlled by the English. A truce would eventually be signed between the two kings, and Edward's mother, Queen Isabella, would become an intermediary for Edward's father and Charles. This was due to the fact that Edward's mother was Charles' sister, Charles being young Edward's uncle. His mother sailed to France to negotiate, and an agreement was reached. As part of the agreement, Edward's father was to travel to France to pay homage for what remained of his Gascon territory. However, at the last minute, Edward's father decided that he did not wish to do so in an effort to eliminate showing submission, and sent the young 14-year-old Edward in his place to perform the homage. Edward did travel to France and paid homage to his uncle, Charles, for Gascony. However, his mother had become fed up with his father's favoritism, specifically toward a treacherous father and son who were much detested in England, known as the Despensers. In fact, the Despensers initially had arrested Edward's mother and had her land seized when the Gascony drama unfolded, due to her French ties. She refused to return to England and also refused to send back young Edward until the Despensers were removed. She became the leading figure of opposition to Edward's father and his detested favorites. Around this time, Edward's mother lined up a marriage to Edward to Philippa of Hainaut, and this was to be in return for Philippa's father providing an army for Edward's mother to use to invade England. It was also said that Edward's mother had begun an affair with a man named Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, an English noble who had been one of the leading nobles that opposed Edward's father previously. He had been captured by Edward's father and was set to be executed. However, he had escaped captivity and was able to flee to France. Mortimer would become an important figure in young Edward's story and will be discussed shortly. Mortimer and the other exiled English barons joined the ranks of Edward's mother's mercenary army, and they invaded England in September 1326 with young Edward by their side. Due to Edward's father's unacceptable kingly behavior, Edward's mother and her army found much support and steadily defeated his father. The detested Despensers were captured and brutally executed, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. However, it was uncertain what to do with Edward's father, as deposing a divinely anointed king was seen as being against God's will. They decided that they would force Edward's father to abdicate, which he did in January 1327, in a sorrowful ceremony of tears and despair. 14-year-old Edward was subsequently crowned as Edward III of England on February 1, 1327, and it was intended that his mother and her lover, Roger Mortimer, rule as his regent until he was to come of age. Edward's father was subsequently imprisoned and was eventually killed, many believe, at the orders of either Edward's mother or Roger Mortimer after a breakout attempt was uncovered. Edward was now a young king who yielded no power, but those who ruled in his stead would find that the young Edward desired to be king sooner than later. Although Edward's father was much despised, his mother's affair with the relatively low-born Mortimer was seen as quite scandalous. Mortimer daftly used his position to accumulate lands and wealth, and unsurprisingly, over a short time, Edward's mother and Mortimer became just as fervently detested as Edward's father was. Edward's father and the Despensers, however unfair and evil, were perhaps more suited to the positions of power due to their political and financial understanding. An army was raised in Edward's name to confront the Scots, who had begun to raid the north again against the backdrop of instability in England. The army, along with the young Edward, marched north but failed to bring the Scots to heel, eventually agreeing to what would become known as the Treaty of Northampton. This treaty was also known as the Shameful Peace in England, as it forced young Edward to renounce his claim to Scotland, acknowledge Robert the Bruce as King of Scots, and allowed Scotland to continue their alliance with France. It was said that young Edward protested to this agreement, but was ignored by his mother and Mortimer. To add to this, Edward's uncle, Charles IV of France, died in 1328 with no male heirs, and thus two main claimants to the French throne arose. The first candidate was young Edward, as he was the grandson of Philip IV. Philip IV was Edward's mother's father, and three of Edward's uncles, his mother's brothers, were kings of France but had died shortly after becoming king. The second candidate was Edward's mother's first cousin, 34-year-old Philip of Valois, grandson of Philip III of France, Edward's great-grandfather. The French inevitably chose Philip of Valois due to the fact that in France, women could not succeed to the throne, and Philip's lineage to the throne had been strictly male, whereas Edward traced his lineage through his mother. More importantly, Philip of Valois was French, while Edward was considered English and an outsider. It should also be noted the relation to these men to a man known as Charles the Bad, who was a great-grandson of Philip IV, and would become King of Navarre, and is someone who will be discussed shortly. Philip of Valois would eventually be crowned as Philip VI of France, and immediately called for 15-year-old Edward to travel to pay homage for his lands on the continent. This was initially refused by Edward's mother and Mortimer, along with protestation of the coronation itself, but eventually they relented, again against the will of Edward, who traveled to Amiens and publicly paid homage to Philip. Many in England didn't realize it at the time, but Edward felt a great deal of humiliation for these two things, the treaty with the Scots and the homage paid to the French. It would plant a seed of discontent in Edward's mind, which would grow as he did, and would lay the foundation for some of his future endeavors. But he had a bigger problem at hand, that being the iron-fisted grip of his mother and Roger Mortimer. By the end of 1329, Edward had come of age, but his power was continuously limited by his mother and Mortimer. He was not allowed to spend or travel, and he was constantly monitored by spies. Edward became increasingly restless and discontented with his lack of control. In 1330, he began to conspire to take control. However, Mortimer caught wind of this and publicly accused one of Edward's accomplices of conspiring against him. Edward felt that he must act, and did so on the evening of October 19, 1330. He, along with a small contingent of his close supporters, bribed the captain of Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Edward's mother were staying. They entered the Inner Bailey via an underground culvert and surprised Edward's mother and Mortimer as they were prepping for bed. Mortimer had multiple attendants around, and a bloody scuffle broke out between the lot. 3 of Mortimer's attendants were killed, with Edward capturing his mother and Mortimer. His mother was said to have begged Edward for Mortimer's life, but it was to no avail. Mortimer was transported to London, tried, convicted, and executed at Tyburn. Edward banished his mother to her dower lands, although it should be noted that she lived very comfortably through the end of her life and would casually reappear throughout his reign. Edward publicly declared that he would now rule in his own right, and stated that all that Mortimer and his mother had done in his name was now no longer valid, setting the stage for his kingship. Edward had finally taken control of what was rightfully his, but this was just the beginning of Edward's aspirations, and his attention would soon turn to his extended family in France. Edward's grandfather, Edward I, had installed English men in Scotland after his conquest of the kingdom during his reign. These men were subsequently ejected when Robert the Bruce reconquered the land. However, the embarrassing Treaty of Northampton, for which Edward was forced to agree, stated that these men were to receive their lands back as part of the agreement. This had been ignored by the Scots, but by 1332, Robert the Bruce had died, and the heir to his kingdom was his 8-year-old son, David II of Scotland. The ignored men now pushed for their lands to be reinstated, and they were led by a man named Edward Balliol, who was the son of a former Scottish king that was installed and then deposed by Edward's grandfather. Balliol landed an army in the north and defeated David's regent's army at the Battle of Dublin Moor and crowned himself King of Scots. He declared his allegiance to England and called upon Edward to support his claim. However, Edward did not support Balliol quick enough, and a counter-invasion caused Balliol to flee, forcing Edward to use force to put Balliol back on the Scottish throne. Edward marched an army north and confronted the Scots, laying siege to Berwick in an attempt to provoke a battle. The Scots obliged, and a battle took place near the town of Halidon Hill. This battle, known as the Battle of Halidon Hill, saw Edward's army rout the Scots, which was mainly brought on by the use of a weapon that had now fully worked its way into the ranks of the English army. This weapon, of course, was the longbow, which allowed archers a much greater range and fire rate than that of the standard crossbow used on the continent. The longbow became a mainstay of the English army, and new military advancements were being implemented by Edward's army. Due to the swath of previous military losses that Edward's father had incurred, the English by that time had developed a reputation as being weak warriors over the years, but lessons had been learned from the battles with the Scots, and the English armies were now developing new tactics in war. The Battle of Halidon Hill utilized some of these new tactics and was Edward's first military victory, which gave him much confidence in pursuing war. In addition, Edward had moved away from summoning armies, or conscripting armies in other words, something that had been utilized by his predecessors. Instead, the majority of his armies were volunteers, fighting for pay and honor, as well as any loot captured from military victory. He enjoyed a great deal of loyalty, as his personality was that fit for a ruler. He learned from his father's mistakes and respected the leading men around him, listening to their counsel and interacting with lower-born members of his armies. He in turn was well respected himself, and many were willing to follow Edward's direction at any cost. This also strengthened his military resolve and added to his desire to pursue war. After defeating the Scots, Balliol was reinstated and ceded a large swath of land in the Scottish lowlands to Edward. The young, now defeated David II of Scotland sailed to France and came under the protection of Philip VI, as Scotland and France had had an alliance with each other for some time. This began to put a strain on the already cold relations between France and England. Although generally the English did not support war with France, and many did not believe that they should be required to serve on the continent, Philip's support of the Scots brought a potential trouble to the homeland, and this, mixed with the volunteer structure discussed before, made it so many became open to the idea of war with France. In 1334, a Scottish rebellion forced Balliol to flee yet again. Edward raised another army and traveled north, but this time was stopped by a harsh winter. He eventually ran out of money and was forced to withdraw. This problem, running out of money, would become a common theme in Edward's military campaigns. For all the love and respect that he carried from his men, he was hopeless when it came to the understanding of the financing and economics of war. His planning was erratic and risky, and we will see that this would be a source of much contention for Edward in his future military dealings. In 1335, Edward attempted the same campaign as Scotland, with similar results. However, his negotiators in France brought word that Philip was dead set on installing David II back to the throne of Scotland, and also on invading England. Panic struck England, and many defensive preparations were made for any potential attack that the French might launch. Although Philip was serious in his threat, this idea was eventually abandoned due to the logistical problems associated with it. However, this had a lasting effect, as now Edward switched 100% of his focus from Scotland to France. In 1337, Philip found reason to take Aquitaine, a territory on the continent controlled by the English, from Edward, and attempted to seize the duchy from England, but was unsuccessful in this. However, this attempt would be the start of a conflict between France and England that would last for decades, a conflict that would see multiple kings come to pass and would infamously become remembered in European history as the 100 Years' War. Philip's move against Aquitaine added to Edward's cause to invade France. In 1337, preparations began for landing an army in France. However, logistically, this was very difficult. Edward could either attempt to land in English-controlled Aquitaine, quite a long sail around the coast of Brittany, or he could attempt to land in northern France, which was a hostile territory. Edward decided to ally with Germany, which at that time was a loose conglomeration of kingdoms that were ruled by princes, but were loosely under the umbrella of the King of the Romans, Louis of Bavaria. Edward set out to gain support from these princes and was successful in his attempts, coming to agreements with many of the leaders, including that of Louis of Bavaria. But all these allies accepted due to the promise of great sums of money. The cost was astoundingly large, and Edward attempted to fund this by trying to create a monopoly on the English wool export. He bought up all the wool in England and intended to sell it at a significantly inflated price on the continent. However, the logistics of this proved to be too much, with long delays and only a fraction of the revenue that was expected being raised. Edward lost much support from the princes due to this. However, he decided to start taking out large loans in order to make his agreements possible, and was eventually able to pay Louis of Bavaria and some of the princes. Unfortunately, the campaign was delayed, and Edward was forced to spend the winter on the continent, using up much needed money and supplies. France was raiding the English coast, and Edward, desperate to raise morale and start his French campaign, continued to borrow foolishly. In September 1339, Edward's campaign finally launched in France. However, the French were well aware of Edward's financial plight. Edward needed to engage in pitched battle in order to secure victory before he ran out of money, and Philip, understanding this perfectly well, simply avoided the English. Edward burned villages and destroyed the countryside in an attempt to draw Philip in, but to no avail. Edward was forced to call off his campaign in failure. It should be noted that many believe that the 100 Years' War began with Edward's public claim to the French throne. That is not the case, as Edward had not yet done this by the beginning of 1340. Eventually, he was persuaded to do so by his allies in Flanders, who were looking to legitimize a revolution that was taking place against surrounding lands that had been taken by the French. His declaration would also give cause to other potential rebellious areas that needed an excuse to rise up. Therefore, on January 26, 1340, Edward traveled to the town of Ghent in Flanders and declared himself as King of France amidst the backdrop of a supportive and cheering crowd. Although in the modern day, many see this as an absolute declaration of Edward's intentions, it is believed that this declaration may have carried little weight in Edward's mind and was perhaps only intended as a political gesture to gain allies or to be used as a bargaining chip. In February 1340, Edward, being heavily in debt, returned to England to raise money, and Philip, after learning of this, amassed a huge fleet to stop Edward from returning. Edward in return raised a massive fleet himself and sailed back in June to confront the French fleet, although it should be noted that the French navy was larger. The two naval forces met at Sluis and engaged each other in what was to become known as the Battle of Sluis. The French were steadily defeated, losing thousands of men in the process, and Edward was slightly injured in the battle. This victory, although a great military success for Edward's record, did not solve his issues on the continent. He continued to borrow foolishly and launched another campaign attempt, which ended similarly, with the French not willing to engage in battle and waiting for Edward's money to dry up. A truce would be agreed to, and it seemed that things were going downhill for Edward by that time. A third of English Gascony had been conquered. David II returned from exile in Scotland, and Edward was forced to flee the continent from his creditors, only to find England, unsurprisingly, in a financial and political crisis. But Edward was steadfast in his goals, and none of this lessened his resolve. In April 1341, Brittany experienced a succession crisis and requested Edward's assistance against the French claimant. Edward was able to raise a small army and travel to Brittany, but again, this third campaign stalled in the same manner that previous ones did, with another truce being signed. 3 years passed after this failed attempt, and political exiles from France began to congregate in Edward's court. These exiles still had support on the continent, and so another campaign attempt was planned in 1344, and it was intended to use these exiles and their supporters. However, although his allies did partake in some battles on the continent, Edward was not even able to launch his attempt due to the fact that he had to travel to Flanders to assist an ally in rebellion. Edward had seen almost nothing but failure in his campaigns in France, but he was learning from his mistakes, and soon his fortunes would change. Edward's stance on the hiring of foreign allies changed after his failures in France, and instead he decided to rely only on English and Gascon support. In 1346, he raised the largest army to head to France in all of the 100 Years' War, landing in Le Hogue. On a hill near where they had landed, he knighted his son Edward as Prince of Wales. This son would become known to history as the Black Prince and will be discussed in more detail shortly. Edward initially wanted to set up a base of operations in Normandy, but Philip, thinking that Edward would land in Gascony, had sent a major army south to confront him. This forced Philip to send a much smaller force to attempt to hold the city of Caen against Edward in the north, but was not able to shore up its defenses before Edward attacked. Caen fell to Edward, and it was at this time that he decided to push his army into the heart of France towards Paris. He had concluded that once his supplies ran thin, he would make a quick escape to the north coast. He sent word to have a fleet ready on the north coast for when this was to take place, and pressed on towards Paris. Edward came within 12 miles of Paris, razing the towns and countryside along the way. Philip, sticking to his usual MO, waited for Edward to run out of money and retreat. This, of course, expectedly came to fruition, and Edward headed north as he intended to do. However, the situation was different this time. Edward's constant harassing of French lands caused much panic in France, and with Edward coming so close to Paris, many were calling on Philip to stand up to the English. Philip was losing face with his nobility and people as an unimpeded English army ravaged his country. Philip felt pressured to finally engage Edward in pitched battle. After Edward headed north, Philip set out in pursuit of him. Once Edward reached the north, he realized that his fleet had not yet arrived, so moved towards Flanders in an attempt to capture a port city or escape to Flanders. However, the French caught up with his army near the town of Crecy on August 26, 1346. The subsequent battle that took place, known as the Battle of Crecy, began at 5 p.m., with the French army crossbowmen advancing first. They did not realize what they were up against, and were slaughtered, as the English longbows' range was significantly longer than theirs. As the crossbowmen retreated in confusion, the French cavalry advanced in confusion, trampling much of the crossbowmen. Intense battle erupted between the French cavalry and the English defensive line, with Edward's son, the Black Prince, being in the thick of the battle. Edward, spectating from a high point, was said not to have sent in his reserves immediately in an effort to allow his son to cut his teeth and attain glory on the battlefield. Eventually, the French were defeated and forced to retreat, with thousands of noble and low-ranking casualties. The French expected Edward to return to England after his victory, but they were mistaken. Edward moved to Calais and laid siege in an attempt to form a permanent English stronghold in the north of the continent. Philip encouraged the Scots to raid into England in an attempt to draw Edward away, but Edward was resolute in his French interests and did not budge. It wouldn't matter, as David II's forces were unexpectedly defeated at the Battle of Neville's Cross by a locally recruited army led by the Archbishop of York. David was captured and moved to the Tower of London, temporarily ending the Scottish threat. Philip attempted to raise multiple armies, but was unable to do so due to the lack of money and enthusiasm on his nobility's part. However, eventually he was able to muster an army, but not before Edward had reinforced his position outside Calais' walls. By the time the French had appeared near Edward's army, Calais was starving and on the verge of collapse. Nothing could be done from Philip's position, and eventually Calais capitulated to Edward in one of the greatest achievements of his reign. A much-remembered scene would unfold after Calais submitted. Edward had not wanted to come to terms with the famished city, and only agreed to terms if 6 wealthy leaders of the town emerged with the keys to the city and nooses around their necks in preparation for their execution. These burghers, as they were called, begged for mercy, and many urged Edward to forgive them, with Edward ignoring all. However, only when his queen, Philippa, pushed for their pardon did Edward relent, relaying great forgiveness in the form of public show. Edward had made great gains at Crecy and Calais, and had attained a degree of prestige with these victories. However, the celebration would be short-lived, as things were soon to drastically change. Edward, like his grandfather before him, was a man of great ceremony and show, going to great lengths to portray majesty and honor. After his victory at Crecy, he created what was known as the Order of the Garter in order to commemorate the battle victory. The Order of the Garter, initially set up as 2 tournament teams, is a chivalric order used as a knighthood honor system, and Edward dedicated it to the militaristic saint, St. George, the patron saint of England. This order has survived for hundreds of years and is the most senior order of knighthood in Britain to this day, behind only the Victoria Cross and George Cross. It originally consisted of 26 members, which included Edward the Black Prince. Around this time, a bubonic plague pandemic known as the Black Death swept across Europe, eventually finding its way to England. It is said that as much as 50% of the population was wiped out by the pandemic. This, along with exhaustion and tight financial situations on both sides, caused a lull in major activity for some time. In 1350, Philip VI died and his son, John II, succeeded him to the French throne. John did not have the same political acumen as his father did, and in 1354 disagreements broke out between John and Charles the Bad, who was the King of Navarre and someone we briefly touched on previously. Charles happened to be John's son-in-law and was well known to the English and the French. Charles the Bad contacted Edward and planned an attack on the vulnerable John. Edward by that time had decided that he wished to acquire at a bare minimum the entire Duchy of Aquitaine, as it had existed when his great-grandfather Henry III came to power, and in fact, he had even grander aspirations to retake Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, which had formerly been controlled by England prior to the disastrous reign of the much-detested King John of England. With the coalition between Charles the Bad and Edward implanted into the minds of the French, John decided to negotiate with both. John, incredibly, agreed to cede the entire Duchy of Aquitaine, as it had existed in Henry III's reign, to Edward, along with Anjou and Maine. However, this was not to be, as the treaty was never ratified and the French went back on their word, another common theme we will see. Edward and Charles the Bad began to conspire yet again, and in 1355 decided that it was again time to reopen hostilities with France. It should be noted that by this time, Edward's financial situation had drastically improved, as all of his previous debts over the years had been settled, and some of Edward's great counselors saw to streamlining the customs and taxes of the realm. In fact, Edward was quite strong financially, compared to the French financial situation, which was in disarray. Edward decided on a two-pronged invasion, with his son the Black Prince being sent to Gascony to lead one of the prongs in the southwest. He would send one of his leading earls to invade Normandy. However, he did not plan to partake in the invasion himself. It was the intention to grow both invasion forces once landed, with Gascons in the south and discontented subjects in the north, including that of Charles the Bad. However, the northern prong was forced to return to England due to bad weather, and due to the fact that Charles the Bad had double-crossed Edward and made agreements with John. This meant that John could send the full bulk of his army to confront the Black Prince in the south. Edward did not wish to see this happen, so sailed to Calais and led a 10-day raid into France before returning to England to deal with Scottish raids on English soil. This had the desired effect, and John did not send all his forces south. In the end, nothing came to fruition on this conquest attempt, but the Black Prince was successful in raiding large swaths of lands on the Atlantic coast in the southwest, and had collected an immense amount of loot. Edward, after hearing of his son's successes in the southwest, again revived the idea of another two-pronged invasion. This was aided by a political showdown in France, in which it was believed that Charles the Bad was conspiring with the Dauphin, Charles, the heir to the French throne, to depose John. John moved against Charles the Bad and captured him and laid siege to his allies in Normandy. Edward planned to use this chaos to his advantage and desired to land and meet up with the Black Prince near Anjou and Maine and march together to confront John's forces. However, John made a similar move as to what Edward had done previously to him, sending his allies to raid the English coast, causing Edward to abandon his involvement in the campaign and return to England. This in turn allowed John to organize his forces and turn his full attention to the Black Prince, heading southwest to confront him. Edward's choice to stay in England put the Black Prince in the same situation that Edward hoped to avoid previously. The full force of John's army was marching on the Black Prince's army, and it was said that the Black Prince was outnumbered nearly 2-1. He began to retreat, not intending to engage in battle with John's much larger force. However, he was slowed by his heavy baggage train, and this allowed John to catch up to him near the town of Poitiers. The prince was in a difficult position and was forced to stand and fight. Incredibly, against the odds, the French army was steadily routed by the Black Prince and his allies in what was to become known as the Battle of Poitiers, with John and one of his sons being captured and taken prisoner. The Black Prince returned to England with the captured John and was revered as a hero, and Edward himself was now in a politically strong position. France was broke, in disarray, and nominally ruled by John's son, the Dauphin, along with other French nobles. This group raised taxes, but used this money in the pursuit of prepping for war, not for paying for the ransom to have John released. Charles the Bad escaped his French imprisonment and moved to attempt to install himself as the new French ruler amidst the chaos. John, in captivity, agreed to pay an exorbitant amount of money for his release and also agreed to cede all of Aquitaine as it existed in Henry III's reign, same as had been agreed to previously before the French backed out of the agreement. This would become known as the Treaty of Windsor, sometimes referred to as the First Treaty of London. However, although the Dauphin Charles and his council accepted these terms, the rest of the country violently rejected them, and it was never ratified. The backlash associated with this proposed treaty forced the Dauphin to flee from Paris and allowed Charles the Bad to take control. However, an uprising subsequently allowed the Dauphin to recover control, but he now, unsurprisingly, no longer agreed to the terms of the Treaty of Windsor. Edward, in a rage, planned yet another invasion, and the captive John greatly feared that Edward would join forces with Charles the Bad. He feared this so much, in fact, that he agreed to yet another treaty, the Treaty of London, which ceded not only Aquitaine, as was agreed to prior, but now basically half of France, including Normandy, Maine, Anjou, Brittany, and Touraine. But unsurprisingly, despite Edward's best efforts to make this treaty come to fruition and reassert John's control, it was unsuccessful yet again, and Edward's invasion that was planned in anger went ahead. He landed in October 1359 at 46 years of age and planned to move on the French coronation city of Reims. It was a difficult campaign due to bad weather and French resistance, and the French destroyed supplies before shutting themselves away in castles. Edward reached Reims, but was forced to retreat after a 5-week siege, choosing to go on a campaign of plunder and looting all the way to Paris. The weather continued to deteriorate, and with Edward unable to draw the French from their strongholds into a pitched battle, he relieved his battered and exhausted army and negotiated with the French. A treaty was agreed to, known as the Treaty of Bretigny, which had similar terms to that of the Treaty of Windsor, the first treaty that John attempted to agree to in captivity. Edward would renounce his claim to the French throne and in return be granted an enlarged duchy of Aquitaine in sovereignty, meaning that he did not need to pay homage to the French king for these lands. In addition, Calais would remain in English control, and a dialed-back ransom was agreed to for John's release. Edward and his army returned to England, and John was released shortly thereafter. However, there were disagreements in relation to the ceding and renunciation of the territories agreed to, as well as Edward's renunciation to the crown of France. Neither wished to be the first to hold up their end of the bargain, and unfortunately, these issues would lead to many future problems between the two kingdoms. Edward was at his peak of prestige upon his return to England, and his court became the Central European example of chivalry and pomp. He spent lavishly, indeed foolishly, eating up much of his surplus in this time. Slowly, problems began to arise. John pushed to perform renunciations in relation to the French throne and Aquitaine territories, as the transfer of the territories in Aquitaine had begun and were nearing the finish. However, Edward refused to perform his renunciation until all the land transfer was complete, even in the disputed areas that would have taken a significant amount of time to sort out. Additionally, many English and Gascon troops still held land and castles that were to be given back to the French. Edward was unable to control these garrisons of troops, and they ignored his demands to vacate to John's forces. The ever-menacing Charles the Bad had returned to the fray yet again, looking to continue his fight against John, and one of John's sons, who had been taken captive as collateral so that the treaty would be completed, was paroled to France for visitation and refused to return to his captivity. It also should be noted that the French were unable to come up with the ransom payments agreed to in the treaty as well. All these factors put a strain on the French-English relations, and in 1364, John traveled to England to stand in for his fugitive son until an agreement could be reached. However, while there, John was infected with the plague and died in April. His son, the Dauphin Charles, succeeded him as Charles V of France. However, Charles did not have the same ideals as his father and was all too eager to stand up to Edward and the English. Charles disagreed with his father's attitude towards the treaty with England and immediately set out to undermine and break the terms. Charles was a much more capable politician than his father and methodically brought stability and, more importantly, money back to the French monarchy. Edward had installed his son the Black Prince as the ruler of Aquitaine, and although the Black Prince was a respected and successful military commander, he lacked the political and financial understanding needed to successfully rule such a territory. He was widely unpopular and raised many taxes that pushed subjects into the arms of none other than the new French King Charles V. Charles' acceptance of the appeals from the Aquitaine subjects was in direct conflict with the Treaty of Bretigny, as the territory was to be ruled in sovereignty as stated before, meaning no appeals could be made to the French king. Technically, Charles' claim to Aquitaine had not yet been renounced, due to the fact that Edward had drug his feet in regards to formally performing his renunciation to the French throne as previously stated. Charles used this as the basis of his argument and summoned the Black Prince as a vassal to answer for his perceived transgressions. The Black Prince was outraged and made military threats towards Charles, but in reality, the Black Prince had become ill and his health was failing. In 1369 and 1370, Aquitaine was formally taken back by the French. The Black Prince, although initially attempting to stop the French reacquisition, returned to England in failure and gave up his control of the territory. As the Treaty of Bretigny disintegrated, Edward again resumed using the title King of France as well. However, Edward was growing older, 58 years old in 1370, and he had become more and more reclusive after the death of his wife in 1369. His financial situation also began to deteriorate again, as he had been living well beyond his means in the time since the treaty. All his friends and supportive leaders that he had wooed in the previous decades were all dead, and his new reclusive mentality made it difficult to connect with the new leading men of the realm, including his sons. All these factors led many to lose interest in Edward's claims on the continent, and although Edward attempted to launch a campaign to defend Aquitaine, it was poorly planned and experienced much delays, and ultimately ended in failure. Edward's son, John of Gaunt, who had become a powerful leader in Edward's government, briefly took the military reins in support of Aquitaine, but eventually he too would suffer defeat, with all of the territory gained in the Treaty of Bretigny eventually being lost. Things had steadily worsened for the old king, and unfortunately for England, the future did not look much better. In June of 1375, a truce was signed at Bruges, essentially a formal submission by Edward to the French. Edward's son John of Gaunt and other leading men of Edward's council had been ruling with a great deal of corruption, and in April 1376 a parliament was held which addressed these issues. In a 10-week session, these leading men were accused and accosted for their perceived mismanagement of the realm, and for the losses that had been incurred at the hands of the French. John of Gaunt was one of the main characters accused of such treachery. This parliament would become known as the Good Parliament, and the majority of the attack came from the members of the House of Commons, with many governmental leaders being removed. Sometime after the Good Parliament was dissolved, Edward's son John of Gaunt attempted to reverse what had been settled to, and in a subsequent parliament known as the Bad Parliament, he was successful in reversing much of what had been addressed at the Good Parliament, with the Speaker of the House of Commons being imprisoned. Around that time, the much-beloved Black Prince died at Kennington and was buried at Canterbury Cathedral in October 1376. Edward, with his health failing quickly, was not able to attend his son's funeral. In 1377, he was taken to Windsor and knighted his grandson, Richard of Bordeaux, son of the Black Prince, who was now the heir to the throne of England. This would be Edward's last instance of public show and honor. In June, Edward suffered a stroke, which left him paralyzed and unable to speak, and on June 21, 1377, the glorious Edward III, King of England, died from his ailments. It was said that prior to his death, Edward's household men-at-arms abandoned the helpless king to get their affairs in order, and his mistress, who had benefited greatly from their relationship, was said to have pulled off his jewelry, abandoning Edward as well. Only one lone priest was said to be by Edward's side when he died, a sad ending for a once so powerful and successful king. His body was taken to Westminster Abbey, eventually being laid to rest in a Purbeck marble tomb with a gilt bronze effigy and an inscription that translates to, "Here is the glory of the English, the paragon of past kings, the model of future kings, a merciful king, the peace of peoples. Edward III, fulfilling the jubilee of his reign, the unconquered leopard, powerful in war like Maccabee, While he lived prosperously, his realm lived again in honesty. He ruled mighty in arms. Now in heaven let him be a king. This tomb and tomb effigy can be seen at Westminster Abbey to this day. Many have forgotten the reign of Edward III, even though his time as king saw incredible sequences of events play out. This is perhaps due to the fact that his reign resides between two of the most dramatic reigns in the history of the monarchy, with his predecessor and successor both experiencing tumultuous political atmospheres and ultimately paying severe consequences for their actions as kings. Many of those familiar with Edward believe he was a great king, in fact, perhaps one of the greatest, due to his ability to build great volunteer armies, due to his great military victories on the continent, and due to his dedication to show, splendor, honor, and chivalry. He was respected and revered by his contemporaries and is something that in itself shows his ability as a politician and ruler, with the realm finally seeing eternal peace after the disastrous reign of his father. He no doubt has criticisms. His lack of financial understanding left much to be desired, and perhaps his hard-headed nature played a part in the disintegration of the agreements made after his glorious victories. Much of his military accomplishments were squandered away at the end of his life, leaving some to rethink his great accomplishments as perhaps great defeats. However, the war that began during Edward's reign would not end with his death, and Edward would be raised up by future generations as an example of what true proper kingship should be, with his cause being taken up by many of his future generations with great success. Edward seems to hold a high distinction in the history of the English monarchy, and although it is unfortunate how melancholy and sad things may have ended for this glorious king, it appears that the adoration and glorification is well deserved.